Hello, and welcome to Office Hours with Dr. Dan. I'm Dan. The topic of today's video is grading. And by grading, I mean grading individual student assignments, determining what the student got right, what the student got wrong, assigning a final grade, so many points out of so many possible points, and also determining the final grade for the student, what the grade the student will receive for the semester. Now, grades are very important to students. They are used to win and keep scholarships. Employers can use grades to filter out applicants for students that are applying for a job, whether it's an internship while they're in school or after they've graduated. So grades are important. So because they're so important, it's incumbent upon us as the professor to have a defined, clear, well thought out process and transparent process of how we assign grades to the students. And it's very important that if we have multiple graders grading assignments, that those graders are consistent in the number of points that they take off for a specific assignment or for a specific error within an assignment, because students are going to talk amongst themselves when they get their papers back, and if one student got 5 points taken off for making the exact same mistake that another student's got 3 points taken off, then there's going to be some friction, and rightfully so. So just make sure your graders are all on the same page about how many points get taken off for specific mistakes. And for a definition that we are going to come across later is a rubric, which I had never heard of a rubric when I was a student. It wasn't until I was a professor. And a rubric is basically just a written guideline that tells the expectations of a problem, how many points will be taken off for making specific mistakes during the grading process. So that's not something you're going to pass out to the student ahead of time and saying, if you make this mistake, you're getting this many points off, you're making this mistake, because then that's just basically telling the student how to do the problem. They need to know how to do that themselves. I mean, you may pass out something that says, if you have units missing, if you're supposed to have pounds per cubic foot or kilonewtons per meter squared for the answer, the units of the answer, and you don't have those, you're going to get points taken off. So it's kind of a checklist more for your graders of how many points a certain mistake is going to be worth. But then, if you pass something out to the students, then that can give them an idea of, okay, I need to worry about making sure I'm doing units, I need to work neatly, I need to have my answers down in an orderly manner. And just before we get started, for the record, I do not believe in or support assigning final grades based on some kind of distribution, whether that's a normal distribution, bell curve kind of thing. I believe students should get the grade they earned. If everyone in the class earned an A, great. If everyone in the class earned an F, great. Those are the grades that the students are going to get. So there's not the top 10% get this, the top 30% get this, and so on. To me, that's not right. There are expectations for the class. If the students meet the expectations, then they should pass the class. If the students don't meet enough of the expectations, then they shouldn't pass the class. So everything I'm saying, keep that in mind. I'm not in any way supporting some kind of quota system for grades, or a certain number of students have to pass or can't pass the class. I don't believe in flunk out classes. There are classes that are going to be very difficult in college, and a number of the students may not pass them. That's just the way it is, but that doesn't mean that we as professors have to fail or think we should have to fail a specific percentage of students. That's just not right. That's not equitable. If a student deserves to fail the class, then they should fail the class. If a student deserves to pass the class, then they should pass the class. All right, so now we get into the meat of how we do grading. And one of the things that you need to decide as a professor, are you going to be a lot of points professor or not a lot of points professor? And what I mean by that, are you going to have your homework assignments be worth a lot of points individually or a few points? So a lot of points, a homework assignment is going to be worth 100 points. Not a lot of points, same homework assignment is worth 10 points. And at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter whether you're a lot of points professor or a small number of points professor, because you're going to take off points based on the total number of points available. Meaning, if you think something, not having units is minus 10% of the problem. Well, if it's a 100-point problem, then that's 10 points off. If it's a 10-point problem, it's 1 point off. So it's just, what is your philosophy as far as points? I personally was kind of a small number of points professor where I'd take off fractions of a point, and at the end of the day, it all comes out in the wash. So it's just a matter of how you want to do things, and then you have to be consistent. You can't change midway through the year saying, okay, I'm going to have each homework problem be worth 100 points, and then go down and say, oh, well, this is not the way I want to do it, and switch in the middle of the year and say, now each homework problem is going to only be worth 10 points, because that makes the homework problems at the end of the year not equally valuable as those at the beginning of the year. And we're talking about grading. Grading the class that you're teaching for the very first time can be difficult. You don't know what the common mistakes will be, because if you've taught the class enough, and generally my experience, about the third time you teach a class is you're really in the groove. You really know where the students are going to generally have problems. You know what kind of mistakes they're going to make. You can kind of gear your lectures around keeping the students from making the common mistakes. You're not spoon feeding them the material. You're just making sure during your lecture you're really hitting on, here's where people made mistakes in the past, you need to pay attention to this. So again, there's difference between spoon feeding and just giving them exactly what they're going to need to pass the test, because again, I don't believe in teaching for the test. You have material that you've got to cover and that they need to understand, and if there's areas where students commonly have difficulties, then you can go in and really hit those areas and make sure they understand those areas. But if you don't know the common mistakes are going to be, you don't know how many points you should take off, and to get around that, at least at first, you should really do your own grading. Not necessarily, if you've got a class of 500 students, then I'm not saying you grade all 500 students' work, but you take some of the assignments, random amount of assignments, and you grade those, and your graders are going to be grading the other assignments. This way, you are getting some direct feedback of what the common problems are, what the common mistakes are, so that you are better going forward. Once you've taught the class 2, 3, 4 times, and if you want to pass all the grading off to your graders, then that's fine, as long as your graders kind of keep you in the loop of, well, a lot of students are having trouble with this problem or this particular part of a problem, so that you know, well, maybe I need to go back and address that again in a follow-up lecture. If you're teaching a class for the first time, you may not know the best type of homework problems to assign, or how many homework problems to assign. So one of the things you can do is go and look at files from people who taught the class before. I mean, that as a guideline. Who taught the class before? How did they teach the class? What kind of problems did they give? And you can model the first time you teach the class on what's been done before. That's not to say you blindly follow everything that someone else did, because maybe you're teaching the class because the previous professors did not do an adequate job, so you need to look at what's the best thing to do, and it's generally going to be a balance of what you're familiar with and what other people have done. And homework is supposed to be to reinforce important topics within the class. So if you're teaching a statics class, for instance, then being able to draw and interpret a free body diagram is hugely important. So that's something you're going to hit over and over again. Three-dimensional statics is not something that's used particularly often, so that may be something you have to cover, but then you don't spend a lot of time on it. So there's subjects that you may have to cover, or topics you may have to cover in a class, but there's some that are going to be more important than others. And the thing, if everything's important, then really nothing's important. So you have to kind of prioritize what's the most important topics the students need to hit, and then what are the less important topics, and go from there. And particularly if your class is a prerequisite class, if that class you're teaching is a prerequisite and they're going to need things from that class for follow-on classes, well, what are the things they're going to need for those follow-on classes? So that kind of tells you what you need to concentrate on, what you need to test the students on, what you need to make sure they've mastered. And as far as assigning individual points, the points should be proportional to the amount of work it takes to do the problem. So if you're having some kind of true-false question, fill in the blank multiple choice, and then there's also problems where they have to actually do calculations or write an essay or write a couple of paragraphs to respond to something. The longer it takes someone to work those problems, or the more time that you expect they have to put in on the problem, that should be proportional to the number of points. A true-false question should be worth a whole lot less than a 4-paragraph essay response type question. And include your grading philosophy in the syllabus. What are you going to take off points for? Make sure your students know that if it's an engineering class or something where they're going to have some math type answers, our units are extremely important. Again, is it the answer 75 psi or 75 kilonewtons per meter squared? There's a huge difference between those two, so just having 75, that's the right numerical answer. But if you don't have the units that correspond to that answer, then some points are going to be taken off. And your formatting kind of things. How do you want your homework formatted? Do you want their name on it? Do you want their student ID number? How do you want things done? So you get that in the syllabus, so there's a consistency throughout the semester, and it's your class. You have the right to dictate the formatting and how things are done. Students need to learn that different professors are going to have different policies within the bounds of what is allowed by the university. And that's fine, because students are going to have different bosses throughout their career. They may have a supervisor and a manager at the same time, and one person wants certain assignments handled one way and another wants certain assignments handled a different way. So students need to learn how to follow directions for different people. So if you want all of your writing assignments word processed and right justified, then that's what the students are going to have to do. All right. Again, look to people who have taught the class before for advice. Maybe some of your old professors from your undergrad or grad school career that maybe they're not at the university you're at now. When I taught soil mechanics for the first time, the members of my PhD committee, 2 of them were very generous in providing me with files from soil mechanics classes they've taught before that allowed me to take that in and use those notes to form the basis of the class the first time I taught it, and then each subsequent time I taught that class there were some revisions that went on. How are you going to return homework? I mean, your students have turned it in based on your guidelines. How are you going to give it back? Does your school allow you to take a stack of graded homework and hand it out to the students in class and say, hey, rifle through this, find your own, and move on? Some schools do, others don't, because there's the whole privacy concern that as people are going through, they could see, well, student so-and-so got a really good score and student so-and-so got a really bad score, and some places don't allow that. So calling a student's name and trying to pass something back when you have a very large class, and even if you don't have a large class, that's still going to take time away from lecture. So you have some options. I mean, do you want to have students put their student ID number on it instead of their name? That way you can pass things back. It's kind of like, okay, well, students don't know each other's student ID number unless the students have shared those numbers. So that's one way to do it. I would assign everyone a reusable envelope at the beginning of the semester. They'd have their name on it, and they'd turn the homework into me, and then when it was finished grading, I'd put the assignments into those envelopes after I'd entered them into the grade spreadsheet, and then I could just pass those envelopes back during class, or set those envelopes on the table coming in the door at class, and students knew, okay, excuse me, take my homework out, leave the envelope so it can be reused. So we're not anything wasteful. The envelopes were used, and then at the end of the semester they went back in the supply cabinet to use for inter-office communication. One thing with grades, again, be careful about only relying on publisher-provided material for your class, whether that's homework assignments from the book, or if they have quizzes or a test bank, or not just publisher-provided material, but previous material you've used for the class. I mean, so if you're recycling your old tests, or if you're using the test bank questions that the publisher has provided to you when you pick their textbook, students are going to eventually have access to all of that information. Things that are not supposed to end up on the internet end up on the internet, regardless of whether it's violating copyright laws or not. So you need to be careful. You need to realize that that information is going to be out there, and that's going to give some students an unfair advantage. Right? Whether how much you consider that academic dishonesty of going through and studying a test bank question that's not supposed to be out there is really irrelevant here because it's going to be out there. Those test bank questions are going to be out there. Copies of the solution manual are going to be out there. You need to take that into consideration as you're developing your plan of how you're going to assign homework and how you're going to grade homework. So one of the things you can do to kind of combat that is to include some of your own developed problems you made up on your own in your tests, in your homework, in quizzes. So that if all a student is doing is going through and copying homework from the solutions manual, if all the student is doing is studying test bank questions, if you provide enough newly developed material, then that student won't be able to get an A. I mean, they may get a higher grade than they actually deserve, but at least you're keeping them from getting the A. And now if they've studied the test bank questions and they've also studied the other material, they've actually studied for the test, if they've actually done their own homework, if they've actually learned things, then they'll be ready for whatever questions you give that are ones you made up by yourself, and fine. All right. So my thing is, if a student has access to a previous test, as long as they didn't steal that test from your office or from the computer system of the school, as long as that test was out there, you passed your test back to other students from previous classes, those students made that material available to other students and they used it to study for a test, I think that's a great way to study. And kudos to the students who went out there and made the effort to find old tests so that they know, well, what does this professor consider important, so that I study those topics. Now, if you're going out and recycling the test where you're giving the exact same problem year after year after year, I mean, shame on you. That's pretty lazy. You need to change the problems up. You can have the same problem type, but don't have the exact same problem. That's me on my soapbox a little bit. If I'm offending anybody for that, I'm not particularly sorry for that, because if you're giving the same test year after year after year, that's just being lazy. So when you are actually grading an assignment or a test, don't grade the assignment from start to back for one student, then go on to the next student, grade start to back. Grade the first problem for every single student in the class, and then go and grade the second problem for every single student in the class, and move on that way, so that you're focused on that particular problem type and you're consistent in what you're marking wrong and how many points you're taking off for each type of error. It's like, didn't have units or had the wrong units, -1. Didn't write the formulas out, -1. Whatever you're going to do so that you're consistent. And as you're going through, again, for classes that you're teaching the first time, when you're beginning to do your grading, you can keep a little note on a little scratch pad of the common mistakes that people are making, and then go back and it's like, well, these are big mistakes, so they're the most points to get off, and these are smaller mistakes, less amount of points off. Recheck your solution if you find a lot of students are getting the wrong answer. So if you've got a homework assignment and a lot of students are getting it wrong, and you're using a publisher provided resource, or you made up the homework assignment, go back and check your work if a lot of students are getting wrong, because everyone's human, we make mistakes. If you're using publisher provided material, particularly new editions of a book, then excuse me, there may be errors in the solutions manual. So before you get all the way through, if you're saying, well, there's a lot of people missing this problem, go and check the solution to make sure it's correct. For things like tests, I would pull out the top students, because if you have a small class, you're going to know who the top students are very early on, and I would grade theirs first to see, okay, how's it going, and if a couple of them were getting things wrong, then I would go back and recheck my solution to make sure that I had the solution right. And occasionally I would have made an error in the test. They were right, I was wrong. I caught that before it was given back, or before I went through all of the students' grades or all of the student assignments. So that was helpful. It saved time. And if you're making up a test, it's a good idea to make up the test, let it sit for a few days before you give it out, and then go through and rework the test under the same conditions the students are going to have, meaning that if you have a formula sheet, all you have is the formula sheet. So you can check, did I include the right formulas on there. Things like that. And then you look at it, and it's like, okay, I've included everything. I didn't leave out a critical piece of information, because you want to make sure that you're not just making up the test the night before, you don't check it, you come in, you pass it out to everybody, and then boom, there's some mistakes that you didn't include a piece of information, or you included the wrong piece of information. And there's a big kerfuffle in the middle of the test, or the big distraction in the middle of the test while students are trying to figure out what's going on. They're losing time, they're getting upset. That's not good. And it's particularly important that you've worked through the test if you're going to have someone else proctor it. If you have to be out of town on the day that a test is going on, or even if you're on campus but you're in your office, which is in another building or several floors away, if there's an issue that comes up, how is the proctor going to address that? Do they know what's going on? Can they just say, we'll skip this problem and go on, or can they give the piece of information? So don't just wait till the last minute to make up a test, and never give a test that you haven't run through yourself to make sure that everything is as it needs to be. And then also, when the tests are produced, if they're printed out or run through the copy machine, however that happens, go through and check a random number of the tests. Make sure all the problems are there. Make sure the pages are in the right order. Again, you don't want to have confusion on the day of the test for the students, because that gets them out of sorts. That puts them under additional stress that they shouldn't be. And it's like, well, life can be stressful. It's like, yeah, but you shouldn't have errors on a test that are preventable that's going to cause additional stress when the students are trying to take a test, because again, it's all about their grades. And if you're grading the test and there's a large number of students that are getting the problem wrong and your solution is correct, it's like, are you going to let that problem stand? If 60, 70, 80% of the students get a problem wrong, is that something you're going to let stand? Or are you going to say, well, that was a bad question. Instead of the test being worth 100 points, that problem was worth 20 points. Then we're just going to leave that problem out and the whole test is going to be worth 80 points. I mean, that's an option. And that's going to be up to you what you decide. But, get an outside opinion. Ask one of your colleagues or an upper level student that's already had the course, was this a reasonable problem? All right? Was this an unreasonable problem? Again, you're more likely to come across that the first couple times you teach a class, as opposed to a class that you're teaching for the 7th, 8th, 9th time. If that's topic that may have been out of bounds, or even if it really wasn't out of bounds or too difficult, but a lot of people missed it, is that a core topic? Is that something that students are going to need to know moving on? If it is, regardless of whether or not you let that problem stand, probably a good idea to give them another opportunity to work that problem, meaning give it as a standalone quiz, put it on a future test, make it a longer homework assignment, something like that, because if it's a core topic that they need to grasp and they've missed it on the test, probably something worth going back and touching on again in lecture, and then giving them another opportunity to show you that, oh hey, we finally got the problem. Are you going to award partial credit? Again, where possible. Some, true false, multiple choice type tests. Those are all or nothing kind of tests. As an engineering professor, I never gave those kind of tests because it just didn't work out for the classes that I taught. If you're going to teach an engineering type class, and just because of the size of the class you need to give some multiple choice type questions, like here's this problem, you're doing a soil classification, for example, you've got a large class and grading by hand is just not going to be the way to go, then you get around that by, in your answer choices, you've got the correct answer, and the ones that are the incorrect answers, you get there by making the common mistakes that students are going to make. And this models the engineering licensing test, so that's a good experience for them to get used to taking those kind of tests. So you can give those multiple choice in engineering and science type classes, provided you're reasonable in what you choose for the incorrect answers. They shouldn't just be something totally out of the realm of possibility, so that a student looks like, well, of these 4 choices, these 3 are obviously wrong because the answer is 1, and then they've got 100, 1,000, and 10 million as my answer choices. So, boom, I don't even really have to know what's going on. I just know the order of magnitude of the answer. So you can give multiple choice in engineering and science type classes. Personally, for me, the more upper level the class is, the less valid those kinds of tests are, because they don't really allow for truly seeing how are the students doing their work. Where are they missing the concept, or are they missing the concept, or are they just making a calculator error? Very few things in life are all or nothing. So some professors like, you have to get everything 100% right, or the problem is 100% wrong. And if that's your philosophy, that's your philosophy. Then that's the way it is. Students are going to know that Professor so-and-so does not give partial credit, so they need to adjust accordingly. In life, very few things are all or nothing. Yes, the building needs to make sure it stands up, and if it falls down and goes boom, that's a big problem. But if in the course of building that structure they find there's some minor error, then yes, it'll be a change order and there'll be some hassle and all that. But the building wasn't something that the building was going to fall down and go boom. The dam wasn't going to fail or something like that. So partial credit is an option. And my personal rule was that if it's a math problem they had to work out and there was a formula, they needed to include the formula. They needed to show their work neatly and in an orderly manner. And then the final answer had to have units. If all they did was write the final answer and didn't show me their intermediate steps, they were going to get 0 points. Because you have to show your steps. My philosophy was you had to show your steps. You had to show me how you got from point A to point B. Because as far as engineers go, when we go out and start working at a company, our work is going to be checked by other engineers, other licensed engineers, people who are going to put their seal on it. They need to be able to follow, well, here's where they started, here's how they got through from the beginning to the end in a way that is easily followed. So that gets, requiring that on tests and homework assignments, gets students in that proper mindset of here's how we have to work problems, because when we go out and get a job, we're not going to be working in a vacuum. Someone else is going to be checking our work. And it also discourages cheating. So if someone has an answer that's there's supposed to be 5 steps to get from the beginning to the end, and all they have is the final step, if you can do that in your head, that's great, but I want to see it on the test. A couple of the special type of things that can be used in a class or special assignments that may be in some classes. One of those is a group project. And a group project presents some challenges to grading because you've got multiple people working on the same project, and you have to decide, well, how is the grading going to happen? Is every person going to get the same grade? So if the group, by the time the semester's done and you've added up everything, are they all going to get the same grade, or is there going to be some kind of way for individuals to get a higher or lower grade? And everyone getting the same grade is generally easier from a managing the class kind of standpoint, but it may not be equitable because some people are perfectionists and some people are lazy. So depending on who the group leader is, how dynamic the group leader are, how much they're able to motivate their fellow students to get things done. Some people may put a lot of time in. Some people may put less time in than they're supposed to, yet boom, everyone's going to get the same grade. When it comes time to grade the final presentation, if part of the group project is they have to give a presentation at the end of the semester, consider having some outside industry experts for whatever class you're teaching. I know when I taught senior design, that's the capstone course at school, so the seniors had all year. It was a 2-semester class. They had a presentation at the end of first semester, and they had a presentation at the end of second semester. We had industry experts come in, some of our alumni, some of our industrial advisory council come in to assist in grading that final presentation. So the students knew that you're going to be giving your final presentation to industry experts. Consider having some of your other professors come in and help grade the presentation. So that way there's more of a range of people grading, so it's not just one person has some hang up on some specific thing and they ding a lot of points. So if you're going to have other people come in, and even if you're grading yourself, you need to have some kind of grade sheet so they know, well, here's the maximum number of points for each category, and then they can go through accordingly. If you have a lot of people, 6, 7, 8 people helping you grade, and you can consider throwing out maybe the top score and the bottom score, and that way you're getting more of an average amount of the score that everyone's giving. As one option to consider. If you have 4 to 5 people grading a presentation, that's a pretty good statistical number on how well the students did. Again, provided you gave everyone some grading criteria, and give your students a copy of the same form way ahead of time of here's what you're going to be graded on. There should not be surprises. Students should know what are we going to be graded on. You don't necessarily need to know exactly how many points someone's going to take off for something, because each individual person may be a little different as far as how readable the slides are. Depends on, well, did person so-and-so remember their glasses that day, or things like that. Do you have a procedure for removing a non-performing member from a group? So if there's a group project of 4 or 5 people and one person just is not pulling their fair share of the load according to the other group members, is there a way to get rid of that person? And in reality, there really does need to be a way to do that. In real world, yes, we work in groups a lot, but in the real world, there's the person called the boss. And as I've said in previous videos, in the real world, the boss can lay down the laws like, you are not performing, you are not doing your fair share of the work, you need to step it up or you're going to be fired. Can't fire somebody from school. But there should be a procedure, for the other group members to come to you and say, here's what's going on. We think member so-and-so needs to be removed from the group. And then you need to get the other person's side of the story and see what's going on. So whatever procedure you have, you need to make sure that it follows whatever your university policies are. Because if your policies contradict or in conflict with what the university says, you're in trouble, all right, because the university policy is going to trump your policy. And then you also need to make sure you have a cutoff date for the group coming to you and saying, well, person so-and-so is not doing their work. Coming to you the day of the presentation and say, well, this person didn't do their work, that's why we're not ready. It's like, no, that doesn't cut it. That needs to be, depending on the size of the project, a project that's the whole semester long, somewhere around the month before the final project's due is probably the drop dead date of the group coming to you to try to get somebody removed. And then you need to also make sure, like I say, that the group is not trying to put some unreasonable expectations upon the person they're trying to remove. Is the group calling short notice meetings like, hey, we have these meetings scheduled, this is when we're going to get together and work on it, and then all of a sudden the group leader says, oh, well, it's noon, I'm going to call a meeting for 5 o'clock this evening, and that other person is like, look, I have a job, I'm scheduled to work, I have to be there. I moved my work schedule around to make sure I could meet the meeting dates that we had set up, and now you're trying to add these extra short notice meeting dates. No, I need this job. And that student is, as in my opinion, an exactly valid point. They have worked their schedule around to make sure they are there for the scheduled meetings. The group leaders shouldn't have the right to call these short notice meetings and then expect everyone to drop everything else and be there. People have outside responsibilities that need to be respected. And then are the other group members not getting their work done in a timely manner to pass on to that person so that they can get their work done in a reasonable amount of time, that they have a reasonable amount of time to get their work done. So make sure you get both sides of the story, because if you remove someone from a group project, then they're probably going to end up failing that class or get a much lower grade. And then if you remove them, what are you going to do? What's the procedure for the follow-on? And generally, if someone is removed from a group project from like the senior design side of the house, when I taught it, fortunately never had that issue come up, but if they are removed from the senior design group, then they're going to fail the class, because you have to work in the group. If you can't work in the group, that's part of the whole idea behind the class, then you're going to fail that class and you're going to have to come back and take it again. And will the group members have the chance to submit anonymous feedback about the other group members? So this is a way that you can work in some procedures for people getting a different grade and the students being able to give honest, anonymous, and if it's not anonymous, then chances are it's probably not going to be overly honest, to give feedback about their fellow group members. Are they holding their weight? Do they know what they're doing? And you have some procedure set up for submitting the forms and grading. That gets to be a bit of a pain, especially if you have a bigger class. You have to kind of keep everything together. And are you going to have people rate themselves? Right? Do you come in and, okay, I'm going to kick the top rated score out and the bottom rated score and then use the average of everyone else? So you have to have some kind of procedure or know how you're going to handle all of those forms and all of that process. For senior design, didn't do that because it's basically, I put it to the students early on, do you want to have the chance to do anonymous feedback or do you not want to have the chance to do anonymous feedback? And by and large, they didn't, so we didn't. And what is the grade, the final breakdown of the grade for that class going to be? Are you going to have progress reports that they have to submit weekly or every other week or once a month? Again, progress reports, if you try to match what is going on in the real world, clients expect to be updated every so often on, well, what's going on? Are there any problems? Do you need any feedback from me? And just to make sure that they're on the right track. So progress reports, are you going to count those into the grade? For the presentations, are you going to require one at midterm and then a final presentation? How much of the grade is the presentation going to be worth? And then you have within the presentation the clarity and validity of the visual aids, the quality of the work, how well they get up and speak. I mean, are you going to expect them to be there dressed in appropriate business attire, or is this a class that you don't care if they're up there in shorts and flip-flops? So again, make sure the students know what is expected of them. If you've stood up there and said, I'm not going to worry about how you're dressed, and one group comes in shorts and flip-flops, and another group comes in business attire, it's like, are you going to give extra points to the group in business attire, even though you said you weren't going to worry about how the students were dressed? So again, you need to be consistent. And then, are you going to take points off if the students break the time criteria? Because if you say, okay, you've got 40 minutes to make your presentation, and then there's going to be 10 minutes for questions. I was very much hard-nosed about cutting things off, because students need to know that if your client, when you go out and get a job, says, okay, you can come in and meet with me from 10 to 10:30 to give your presentation, you need to be able to get everything into your presentation in that 30-minute block, because a client is going to be highly upset if you're coming in there and you're trying to take 40, 50, 60 minutes, because your client probably has other things to do. So if you're given 30 minutes, you need to put what you can in that 30 minutes, and some things may have to be cut out, and that's what you need as a student to learn, when to cut things out. You as the professor, it's up to you to say, no, you're at 40 minutes, you're done. And then as far as one of the other things for group project grading is the final deliverable. Is it a report? Is it a set of blueprints? Is it a computer program? How much is the final deliverable going to be worth compared to all the other things? And really the final deliverable and the final presentation should be the massive, or the majority of the grade, because it's a matter of what did they get done at the end. Maybe they looked, they didn't look as pretty at the beginning. Maybe the progress reports weren't as detailed as they probably should have been, but if they pull it through and get the final project together working as it's supposed to and of high quality, then that counts for a lot more, in my opinion, than the little nitnoid stuff at the beginning. Another kind of special grade type thing that presents challenges are term papers, or what I call long writing assignments, many pages, 10, 15, 20 pages. So those present some problems. One, because they take a long time for the students to do properly. They take a long time to grade properly. So to make that process go a little smoother, if I was going to have a somewhat long writing assignment, I would require a first draft due Somewhere around, if you've assigned the paper at the beginning of the semester, then somewhere around the middle of the semester or right after midterms, then they need to have a first draft in, and I would have that first draft count as part of the final grade for the term paper. That way students are going to take it seriously. They're not just going to cobble something together. Forces your students not to procrastinate, so that's good for you and them. And as far as when the final paper should be due, remember the end of the semester is busy for you and the students. You need to give yourself or your graders time to grade that paper. So I never had anything due. Well, I did once have a somewhat major paper due from a class the last week, and that was the last time that happened because that was just too much of a pain in the neck, and live and learn. So I would say for a term paper, with about a month before finals start or 3 weeks before finals start, that's when it should be turned in again. So you have and your graders have enough time to get it done, get it graded. And as far as the students, like, oh, well, that's too quick. If they have the whole semester to work on this, then if they're just waiting till the last 2 weeks to really work on things, then, that's tough for them. So you need to be able to grade it because, the whole thing of just, taking it and throwing it down the stairs and seeing who lands the farthest gets the most points or closest gets the least points or some other way of grading that does not involve actually reading through the whole thing. If the students are going to put the time in to do that, then the grading staff needs to come in and actually read through and grade that paper. If your school has a writing center, some place where students can go and take their writing assignments and not, the writing center staff is not going to write the paper for them, but they're going to give honest critique. Are you going to require that your students run their paper through the writing center? If you are, then you need to touch base with the writing center and kind of say, well, okay, when, can my students get through here? I mean, they're going to be responsible for making their own appointments, but you need to consider that when you come in and take your and set your due date so that the writing center is going to have enough time, and consider having someone from the writing center coming in and talking to the class about the procedures and that. And I realize some schools that have writing centers, part of freshman orientation is going to a presentation by the writing center. But if it's junior, senior year and the folks haven't ever gone to the writing center, then it's probably a good refresher. I never required students to go to the writing center just because when I was doing it, they're junior, senior, just like, I need to see how you can write on your own. Some good, some bad. So that's just an option that you have. And my advice as far as page length is to keep it reasonable. Coming in and saying, oh, you need to do a 50-page term paper, a 30-page term paper. You need to give some kind of guideline so someone doesn't come in and turn in 5 pages and defeat the purpose. But do you really want to have to grade a bunch of 100-page term papers or 60-page term papers? So it's a matter of what subject is the term paper about, how many pages can adequately cover it. I mean, just FYI, my PhD dissertation, from the main body of it, not with the reference list and the addendum, was less than 75 pages. 75 pages. That was my PhD dissertation on modeling soil compaction beneath a vibratory roller. Because, I write for, my living, I write technical reports, and I try to be as succinct and direct as possible. And I carried that over into my PhD dissertation. The subject matter was covered, and it was covered well, but I didn't have fluff in there. And the more pages you tend to require from your students, the more they're going to be tempted to put in fluff to get their pages. So if someone can write succinctly and directly and write well and get something covered in 15 pages that takes someone else 20 pages, generally have some kind of range and let students know if you come in with, if the range is 15 to 25 pages to cover this subject and you come in with 15 pages, you better be writing damn well. Because if you come in with crap in 15 pages, you're going to have a whole lot more trouble. So consider keeping page length reasonable. And so now we move on to final grades, determining the final grades for the class. And at the beginning of the semester, when you're in your syllabus, the students should know what the breakdown between A, B, C, and D is. Was that 90, 80, 70, 60, or something else? But then what are you going to include in final grade? Because there's homework, there's quizzes, there's tests, there's the midterm and final, there's other tests, group projects, term paper, lab reports. Are you going to include attendance and participation, professionalism, whatever you want to call that category? And if you're going to include attendance, do you have a way to take attendance? Are you going to take attendance every day? Are you going to take attendance a few times out of the year? Are you going to say, well, here's a day that I gave a quiz so that I can go, and I give my quizzes at the beginning of class. I can go through here and say, okay, well, all these people got a grade for that quiz, so I know they were there at the beginning of class. Boom. That's one of the days I'm using for attendance. Just so however you do that, if you're like professionalism, does everyone start off with so many points? And if they're late to class, you deduct. If their cell phone goes off in class, you deduct. If you catch them texting or playing around on the internet during class, you deduct points. So you don't have to have this attendance and whatnot at most schools. It's something that a lot of my professors didn't. It's like you were expected to be to class, and if you're not in class, if you're missing a lot of class, we have the right to get rid of you. And where I taught at Prairie View, there was a provision in the student handbook that if a student missed X number of classes, the professor had the right to remove them from the class regardless of what their grade was. So, whether you or not you have attendance as part of your grading is, again, up to you. And then extra credit. Are you going to have extra credit? So difference in partial credit. Extra credit is additional assignments that are optional that students can do to improve their grade. My first semester teaching, I wasn't going to have extra credit. I specifically called out in the syllabus, not going to be extra credit. And then students were coming to me at the end of the semester, towards the end of the semester, and it's like, hey, I need an opportunity, or I'd like an opportunity. Unfortunately, they asked nicely. So I relented and came up with the ways for students to get extra credit. And you have to make sure that every student has the opportunity to do the extra credit. Because if you do for one student, give one student an opportunity, and you don't give the other students an opportunity, then those other students have a very valid right to be angry and challenge their final grades, because why are you giving so-and-so an opportunity that you didn't give the rest of us? And my extra credit was not easy to do. It was basically they had to get an article about, a journal article about some aspect of the class. I'm teaching civil engineering, so they're getting some kind of civil engineering article or an article about an engineering failure. And to get a maximum of 1 percentage point added to their final grade, they needed to review that article, summarize it, and give a reaction to it. So it wasn't just a book report. It's, well, what was learned? What can you carry forward into your professional career from this article? And if they did that correctly, like I said, they could get a maximum of 1 percentage point added to their final grade, and they could do that a maximum of 5 times in the semester. So it's not something that someone's going to be able to go from an F to a B or a C, but someone may be able to go from an 87 up to a 90 where they could get an A, or go from a 77 up to an 80 where they could get a C, something like that. So, and grammar, spelling, punctuation counted, and all that kind of stuff. And then we've got all these different categories: tests, quizzes, group projects. How much is each category going to count towards the final grade? And again, in general, it should be the greater the amount of effort for that particular category, the higher the percentage should be towards the final grade. So tests, midterm finals would be the highest. Down at the lowest is like attendance and quizzes and homework, and then everything else somewhere in the middle. And again, you should spell this out in the syllabus at the beginning of the class. I know I keep referring to the syllabus. There is going to be a video coming up on the syllabus. I'll include an example syllabus. I say down in the description block, there's a way to go and get to either my website or send me an email, and I can send you all of my talking points so that you have these. And one thing, when it's all said and done and you've calculated the final grades and you go through and you're looking at those, how does your final grade distribution compare to historical data? And again, I'm not saying that you inflate or stymie the grades or deflate the grades based on historical data, but especially if you are teaching the class for the first time and that class has had an 80% passing rate previously, and or 80% of students have C's or above, and you're looking through and you have 40% of the classes failing. Well, you need to look at that and it's like, were you being excessively tough? Did you have unrealistic expectations? Is this an undergraduate class and you're treating it like a graduate class as far as what you expect from the students? You need to look at that. Was the previous instructor just way too easy and that instructor was giving away grades? Because if you have this go from 80% passing to 60% passing, there's probably going to be some questions from the department head and the higher ups, and you just need to be able to justify that. It's like, look, this was an abnormally small class. Normally there's 30 people in this class. There was only 10 this time. So you've got the fewer people in the class, the more the data can be skewed. Previous instructor was way too easy. Maybe that's why you're teaching the class. Maybe this is a prerequisite class for follow-on classes, and the other professor was just giving away grades that meant that students, as they were going on to follow-on classes, were having a tough time. So you were brought in to teach the class the way it really needs to be taught. So again, I'm not saying that you artificially inflate or deflate grades. You just need to know how your final grades are stacking up against historical data, so that if there's a big difference one way or the other, then you're able to justify that. If more of your students are passing, well, is that because that you had extra help? You gave the right homework problems? Something like that. What did you do that's causing all these additional students to pass, so that people aren't saying, well, you're just giving grades away? It's like, no, here's how I did that. I made an optional one hour an evening a week that I would be here at school when we'd work problems together. Not that we did homework problems, we just worked additional problems so students who wanted to come in could get that help, and these students took advantage of that help. Or you assigned, hey, there's this video out there on the internet that kind of covers this. If you're having trouble understanding or you want to work these problems, go look at that internet video. I've heard it said before that if a student fails a class, that it's the fault of the professor, and to which I replied, bullshit. There are bad professors out there, but there are also lazy students. So if a student does not do the work, if the student doesn't show up to class, if the student shows up to class but isn't prepared, if the student doesn't do their own homework, if they don't study for the test, if they have earned their F, then they need to receive an F. We as professors are kind of the gatekeepers, or some of the gatekeepers of our profession. So if we're teaching engineering, particularly the basic foundation level classes like statics, mechanics of materials, the basic classes, if a student can't master those classes, again, assuming that the professor is a reasonably competent professor, that they know what they're doing, if the student isn't willing to put in the work to master those foundation classes, do they really need to be in the profession? So I'm not talking about just picking on students that you don't think should be in the profession. Everyone should be welcome into the profession if they can learn the material and are willing to do the work. So students need to do the work. College is hard. You're learning new things. And in other videos I've used the example of you're learning a musical instrument. Most people didn't pick up a musical instrument and play where they could get invited to join some philharmonic 3 weeks after they picked up the instrument. It takes years and years of practice. Becoming a good engineer or whatever you're going to school for takes work. If the students aren't willing to put in the work, particularly in the foundation classes, the prereq classes that they're going to need that information following on, they need to get the grade that they deserve. If they earned a C, then they need to get the C. If they earned an F, they need to get the F. If they earned the A, congratulations, you earned your A. And you earned it, so carry on and go forward. Kind of a side note on grades. If your school does not have plus or minus grades, consider lobbying for that. I mean, this is just, again, personal opinion on my part. I mean, having A, B, C, D grades and nothing else really is kind of, I hate to use the phrase unfair, the word unfair, but I will. It's kind of unfair because a person who got an 88 in a class, that's a B, and the person that got an 80 in the class is also a B. Well, the person that got an 89 probably learned a whole lot more than the person that got the 80, but they're going to get the same number of grade points. Whereas if you have plus and minus grades, then the person who got the 88 is going to be a B plus. They're going to earn more grades, more grade points than the person that got the 80, which is the B minus. So most of the schools I went to had, well, 2 of the 3 schools I went to had plus minus grades. 1 did not, and then where I taught did not have plus minus grades. So I think they're valid because the plus minus grades are valid because they give a better indication of how well someone learned the material. And just at the end here, again, remember, you as a professor are part of the quality control for your profession. If you're teaching future doctors, people need to know that the person who graduated med school, went on to become a doctor, earned the grades that they had. They weren't just promoted through because it's like, well, we don't want to have to go through the paperwork of failing this person out. We'll just carry them on and try to depend on the licensing exam to weed out the bad people. And the same goes for engineering. You know, we as engineers, to be a practicing engineer, have a licensing exam requirement. CPAs have a licensing exam requirement. But again, you know, people need to get the grades that they earned, and it's incumbent upon you as a professor to have, again, the clear, defined, transparent method that you're going to do your grading and assign those final grades so there's no surprises. You know, a student should be able to save everything you pass back to them, look at the syllabus and say, okay, how are my grades supposed to be calculated? They should be able to calculate the grade after everything's said and done and get the same grade that you did. If they calculate that they got a B, then they should get the B. Now, as I've talked about before, if your 90, 80, 70, 60 is your minimums to get an A, B, C, then if someone got an 89, because if you have a bunch of people that are clustered around 91, 90, 89, well, most places, most schools will allow you to say, okay, I'm going to circle all of these, and those people that made 89, I am going to award the A because everyone's clustered around here. Now, if you've guaranteed that the minimum grade for an A is 90 and someone has a 91 and you're like, well, all these other people for A's are way up here, you know, the lowest other A was 96 and then we go all the way down here to 91. Well, if you've said in your syllabus that a 90 or above is an A, then that 91 person needs to be awarded the A. So again, grades are important to students because it's all about keeping scholarships, getting scholarships while they're in school, getting a good job after school. And like I've said in another video for students, grades are important while students are in school and for a few years after they get out, and then they stop mattering. But again, while we are teaching students, while they are in school, those grades are important, so we need to make sure that we take grading seriously. So thanks, hopefully this was helpful. Take care, and I'll see you next time.